Okay, I think the streaming has just started, so everyone should hear and see us now. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Sascha Benjamin Fink. Sascha received his PhD at the University of Osnabrück's Institute for Cognitive Science and is currently junior professor for neurophilosophy at Otto von Guericke Universität Magdeburg. He is working on foundational issues on the neuroscience of consciousness, transformative experiences, the psychology of vagueness, and the role of paradoxes in the sciences. And I'm really looking forward to your talk, Sascha. And I think you can start.
Thank you. I just also wanted to add that Vanya and I also share something else. We are also both editors-in-chief of a great journal, Philosophy and the Mind Sciences. So if you're bored by my talk, check that out on the internet. Can I already share my screen? Wonderful. Then we'll try this. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Can anybody could shortly indicate whether they can see the presentation?
Yes, I can see the presentation. Looks fine.
Yes, we can see it. It's just a little bit big here, but we can see it.
It's a little bit big.
A delay. There's a delay we get at time, but it's always
okay. Well, anyway. So yeah, welcome.
Also, sorry, it's sorry for interrupting. I think it's we also see the next slide. So perhaps
that's not what should happen. Wait, let me see.
Yeah, we also see the presenter. It's a presenter mode.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's not what should happen.
So perhaps first go into full screen mode and then share your screen.
I see. Or can I just do this? Does this work?
Yes.
Yes, it's working.
Wonderful. All right, let's do it like this. So wonderful. Welcome to the talk. I'm going to talk about testing for neural correlates of consciousness, which has been something of an interest of mine for the last few years. So the talk will be a little bit complicated, so I'm gonna show you a little bit beforehand what I'm going to talk about. The first will be mainly Vorgeplänkel, and if you don't know this, if you're living in Germany or if you're having to do with Germans, you have to know the word Vorgeplänkel. It just means preliminaries. I'm going to talk about why consciousness is odd. I'm going to talk about the problem of spurious correlations. And I'm going to talk what an NCC should be. And that seems odd because normally there seems to be like a normative thing. And actually it is here, but there's a good reason why I'm talking about something a little bit normative in this regard. And then after having all the Vorgeplänkel done, I'm going to talk about how we can test for proper NCCs, the ones that we should search for. And I'm going to talk about 4 sufficiency tests. And then I'm going to talk a little bit how we might go beyond sufficiency tests and talk about comparative testing. All right, let's talk about this crazy little thing called consciousness. Most of you might have heard or read that consciousness is not available in every language, and even not in the European languages forever. It's been introduced in the writings of Descartes as conscientia, but there it had this kind of weird double meaning of what we call today consciousness on the one hand and conscience on the other. The real term consciousness, in the way that we're thinking about it, differently from conscience, it comes in the writings of Malebranche in the 1676. He distinguishes conscientia into 2 things and picks out conscience, which is a few years before Locke, he talks about consciousness, as the sentiment intérieur, the inner sense. And there we have this idea of what consciousness might be, in a way of which we can become acquainted with our own minds. Now, this is not the only time that consciousness has been analyzed and then, broken apart. It has happened again. Today, we distinguish between 2 big classes of consciousness or kinds of consciousness, namely access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. And this will matter. So a mental state X is access conscious if X is used by other cognitive modules. So for example, if you can take this thought and deliberate about it, you can reason with it, you can explicitly plan with it, you can use it for guiding your behavior, or choose to not guide your behavior in this way. As long as it's, or the information in this mental state is used by other modules, we will call this access conscious, right? So we somehow, parts of our mind know that this is happening here. Roughly, access consciousness is pretty much what the mind does. So it's an awareness of what the mind does, what's there in the mind. This can be distinguished from phenomenal consciousness. X appears, mental state X, phenomenally conscious, X appears somehow or feels like something to the experiencing person. And there it's more not what the mind does, but how the mind feels. And there's some idea that these might be really two different concepts. And the different question is, well, if there are two different concepts, are there also two different phenomena? And in the neurosciences, lots of prominent people like Koch and Victor Lamme think that there might be two different phenomena. But here's something that you cognitive science might love. So access consciousness is already treated by Koch-Psi. It's used, you can say, and if it's just about the access of information by different cognitive modules, well, then it's already used, for example, in explanations of actions or action planning or generally planning, all these kind of things. Phenomenal consciousness very often, if it comes specifically, if it can be distinguished from access consciousness, it doesn't seem not necessarily functional. It seems to have, qualitative properties that may or may not be accessed, can have these outside of functions. So the question would be, if they're not functional, why care, right? So one reason why you might care is they seem to be very morally relevant. Our moral thinking, what we think are things we have to be good towards, seem to partially be determined by whether we think they can experience in this phenomenal sense. Here's a study by Gray and Wegener. They had these different types of things, these different stand-ins, babies, chimps, a dead woman, a dog, a fetus, a frog, a girl. I don't know why it has to be a dead woman, but anyway, like a dead person, robot, then there's you, God. Like they had all these kind of weird things that people had to compare and say which is more similar to which. And two dimensions explained the similarity groupings best. And they were whether these things can experience. You see, the robot is pretty low. The dead person is a little bit higher than the robot. And then you, me, and everybody, we're pretty much high up. And agency, whether we have plans, we act in a planned manner, all these kind of things. And there you see, like, God is pretty high up, pretty much like you are, right? So the interesting thing is that this grouping correlated with moral dimensions. So people were asked, if you were forced to harm one of these characters, which one would it be more painful for you to harm? Painful for you to harm, right? And so the idea there was that the majority of the things that we don't want to harm score very high in the experience dimension. So they relate this to Aristotle's classic distinction between moral agents whose actions can be morally right or wrong, and moral patients who can have moral right or wrong done to them, right? So where we think our duties lie depends in part whether we think that these things are phenomenally conscious. And you may see that there are some things where we are not sure how they score, namely these three. And those are specifically a category where there's a lot of moral discussion going on, right? Animals like frogs, fetuses, right? Unborn humans, people who are comatose. The question is, do we have moral duties toward them or not? And this, in part, seems to depend on whether we think they're phenomenally conscious or not. So if we knew whether frogs, fetuses, comatose patients are conscious or not, we would know whether they would have per se moral status or not, given that our moral intuitions are right? So there's a good reason why we would like to know whether frogs, fetuses, comatose patients, whether things generally can be conscious or not. So that would be cool, right? We could then know where our moral duties lie. But here's the problem. Take a very general state which feels like immensely intense. Think of something like dreaming, right? The cool thing about dreaming is that, you probably do it every night and it feels kind of nice and good and cool. But you might forget it when you're awake and nobody else might know it. Like in this painting, right? So the nun is dreaming all these kind of dreams that she should not have, right? And all the other nuns might never know about it. This is the cool thing about dreaming, right? The mind is our own. There, at least. This thing is not only anecdotal, the problem that we cannot directly access the phenomenality of others. It also pops up in research on phenomenality. And I'm picking specifically this one because I love it, right? So the field space people are here. You should definitely talk to them because this is one of the studies I'm most excited about in the field of consciousness studies. Over several researchers, they took data from this field space belt, right? The compass attached to certain vibrators that in these studies always vibrated where magnetic north was. And the question, they had two hypotheses, right? So one could be, in principle, weak integration. In principle, the sensory information provided by the belt can be processed, thereby training can improve performance. Pretty much, it's like a tool, right? The more interesting one is the new modality one. Mastery of the belt imposed sensory motor contingencies. And sensory motor contingencies are supposed to be sufficient for specific qualitatively new experiences, specific qualitative changes in phenomenal experience. And they immediately see a problem. Neither physiological measurements nor navigational performance tests can give us insight what the quality of spatial perception with the belt is, right? So they have these two different type of hypotheses. You get a new sense or you get a cool new tool, right? And they certainly are different, right? Tool use is different than experiencing things, right? And they see that there's a problem in the methods that they have available. So they do the brave step of going forward, right? And say subjective reports are controversial because they're prone to distortion. But for some questions, especially those concerning qualitative experience, subjective reports are the only way to find an answer. Only introspection can decide whether a certain change in sensation has been experienced. This is, they really choose first-person methods. And we can generally talk about this as the non-publicity method problem. Here are a few things, right? Here's the metaphysical version of it. How mental events appear to us, that is, their phenomenality, is not directly observable from the outside. Only you can feel your pain as pain, right? Phenomenal features can only be assessed as phenomenal by the experiencing subject. You can experience your pain as pain, how it feels. I can only, assess it as, oh, you're groaning, you're moaning, and I then infer either consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, that you're in pain, right? But I don't feel your pain, right? So in this sense, phenomenality is not public. It's not publicly available. But that's odd, right? Because nothing in the physical world is non-public in this way, even if it's owned or subjective, right? Taste is subjective, but I can know, you can tell me how your taste preferences are, right? There's nothing that I miss there, right? I can let you choose between different things that you like, right? And see where your taste preferences are. There's nothing problematic there, even though taste is subjective. And even if things are owned, like, you know, every mental state is owned by someone, if there are someones, right? But so is acne, right? Or a skin rash. Doesn't mean that we can't have a science of skin rash, right? No problem there. But phenomenality seems to be very different in this way, that it's really non-public. So if nothing in the physical world is non-public in this sense, where could consciousness have its place in the physical world? That's the metaphysical problem. I personally like the epistemic version more. It has something to do with how science works, right? Science is anarchic. There's no popes in science, right? There's nobody that you can ask and then they, by authority given to them by God or whatever power, right, they can tell you the truth. And only they can. No, science is anarchic. You're not, and nobody in science is allowed to have any kind of special powers of observations that I can't have. I might like the training, but if I get the training, I can do it just as well as you can, right? That's the idea of science. There's no special methods that only one person in principle can use towards any kind of token that is scientifically available. Science is anarchic, and that's the great thing about science. So the question is then, if I'm the only one who can access it, I have a special privilege, right? So the question is, how could there be something like a phenomenal science? That's a general problem, right? But, you know, there are certain people who go, you know, who ignore this problem in a very interesting way. And very often it's done like this, you know, okay, but come on, something will change in the brain whenever there's a change in experience, right? So we can look for neural correlates of consciousness, right? And even though I can't observe consciousness in the frog itself, right? I can, if I know the neural correlates, I know that they're conscious or not, right? These are publicly accessible and they're physical, right? So if I knew the neural correlates, I can say whether a person in a coma or in anesthesia really is conscious at the moment or not. I can say whether you're dreaming or not if I knew the neural correlates and I get access to your brain. And I could finally also determine the question whether you're getting a new sense or you're just learning a new tool in these kind of studies, like the field space belt. This is the promise, right? Finally, this principally non-public thing could be available publicly. That's the idea. If we knew neural correlates. But then there's the problem of spurious correlation. What correlation? Well, at the heart, it is a degree of dependence between the values of two variables, x and y, right? And in neural correlates, the variables are what happens in consciousness, what happens in the brain, right? Those we want to correlate. We want to say which ones of those actually are dependent on each other. But correlation is thus pretty much a statistical notion, and a statistical notion that comes in degrees up to where it approaches zero, right? Anything that just slightly, nearly every two variables will correlate to some degree. So things may correlate, first of all, that have nothing to do with each other. And that's what's called spurious correlation by Pearson. Pearson, I think that's how you pronounce this. Here are nice examples of this. The first is the divorce rate in Maine correlates beautifully over 10 years with the per capita consumption of margarine in the US, right? Wonderful. If you would ever see such a correlation in an empirical paper, you're blessed, right? There's the other way around, right? The honey-producing bee colonies correlate perfectly in a negative way with juvenile arrests for possession of marijuana in the US for 20 years, right? It's a degree of correlation that is just gorgeous, but there's no internal correlation, right? There's no deeper meaning to this, right? Hopefully you agree. I think you already triggered of thinking what they might have to do with each other, but you're wrong. There's no connection at all, right? And this is the worry that we have in consciousness studies. Just finding neural correlates of consciousness, first of all, may not tell us anything about where consciousness has its footing in the world, right? Because we should expect spurious correlation, and even spurious correlation to a really high degree. Second, It might be trivial to find NCCs if we allow for any degree of correlation, right? Those were just the great examples of spurious correlation I showed you, right? But correlation comes in various degrees. So in the end, we're not interested in any neural correlate. Only some are interesting, right? Only some of those. And so the question is, which ones? And that's where we're going. We have to understand what do we want to know from a neural correlate, and then discard all the ones that don't fulfill these kind of promises, right? So what should a neural correlate of consciousness be? The term neural correlate of consciousness has been around in the 19th century already. It's even mentioned in the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1911 under the heading of psychology. But as soon as introspectionism in psychology became, not en vogue anymore, and behaviorism and then cognitivism take over, consciousness was, was a bad word. It was the other C word, if you want to, right? So it was not studied, it wasn't used. The only thing where it remained a little bit is in Gestalt psychology and psychophysics. But it was reintroduced in the mid-1900s by Francis Crick in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. And he mentions it and he gives a rough understanding of it. We may be able to say that you perceive red if and only if certain neurons or molecules in your brain or in your head behave in a certain way. But that's not what everybody thinks about when they're talking about neural correlates of consciousness. So why not if and only if? Well, here's one reason, right? We're all thinking about data. We're all thinking about AI. Could it be that a non-neural system could have consciousness? Well, if they could, well then, if and only if means the neural stuff is sufficient and necessary. But here, no neurons, if they can be conscious, the neural stuff doesn't seem to be necessary. The second is less science fiction-y, but more medical. So think of cases of neuroplasticity, right? Here we have a picture from the Lancet, a whole hemispherectomy. The 7-year-old girl who's got half of her brain removed still has all the motor control for the left side of her body and is bilingual in Turkish and Dutch. So it stands to reason that she has not lost the experiences of her left side's body, right? Even though she's missing the right side of her brain. I'm not confusing left and right here, but anyway, you get what I mean. So the feelings of her body, what we usually think the neurocorrelate would be on one side of the brain, she probably has these. They moved over to another thing, another part of the brain. So it's not that a specific area of the brain is necessary for having specific experiences. Other areas of the brain could take over neuroplasticity. So a specific area of the brain is not necessary for consciousness. The last thing would be, well, okay, so let's go with something sufficient, right? Name me something that's sufficient for my experience of red, right? So there's a red dot right there. And here's one I could tell you. The activity of my brain, of my whole brain at the moment is sufficient for that. That's true, but kind of uninformative, right? So what we would like to have is we would like to shrink down to those areas that do most of the contribution to my experience right now, right? And so reason 1 and 2 speak for mere sufficiency, not necessity. And reason 3 speaks for minimality. We want to have the minimally sufficient correlate of consciousness. So logically, if A is merely sufficient for B, then B can occur without A. Therefore, a lack of A does not entail a lack of B. That's the idea. So for example, brushing one's teeth is sufficient for removing plaque, but so is pulling one's teeth, right? Hardcore. And this old saying, there are many ways to skin a cat. It's pretty much exactly what we're here. So today we understand the neurocorrelate of consciousness as a neurocorrelate of consciousness of an experience C. The NCC of C is that neural process N, whose occurrence is minimally sufficient for the occurrence of C. is equivalent to if C does not occur, neither does that neural correlate. But it's not equivalent to if N does not occur, neither does C. And this is the definition we find in this book by Thomas Metzinger, Neural Correlates of Consciousness, in the contribution by the philosopher and open panpsychist and dualist Dave Chalmers. And every type of neuroscientist accepts it. There you've got it, minimal and sufficient. Now, here are 4 kinds of sufficiency testing, right? How can you test this, right? You would still find a lot, but to some degree, you also want to test whether you got the right candidate. So testing for sufficiency means if an end state is sufficient for consciousness, therefore every state in an end state is conscious. And there are 4 different types of tests that you can do there. The first is, and they depend on what kind of predictions you can make in what you make in testing these, right? The first is the which test. If organisms, in the which test you ask which systems are conscious. If an organism O's neural system can be in an end state, then this organism can be conscious. So in general, it's a test for creature consciousness, right? So let's take 2 example theories like recursive processing theory, like recursive processing is what is the neural correlate of consciousness, or thalamocortical loops. The thalamus, the loops between the thalamus and the cortex, they're what brings about consciousness. On the one you've got Victor Lamme, the other has recently had a great update with Thales Bachmann, Monotaka Suzuki, and Gian Aru. So then we can ask, for example, something that's a standard model organism for consciousness studies or for neuroscience in general, zebrafish, right? Zebrafish, well, they don't have a cortex, right? So if we could find out that zebrafish are conscious, right? This would mean that the thalamocortical theory, right, because they don't have a cortex, would be wrong. Or would it be wrong? Well, at least we know that recursive processing is probably a better candidate. The problem is that consciousness is non-public, and behavioral tests in non-human animals are then hardly decisive. How do we find out whether the fish is conscious? So maybe we, leave fish aside. We start by finding the neural correlates with things that are not as fishy as fish, right? More things that are close to things where we know that they're conscious, right? Like you and me. So this is the when test. We don't ask when, which things are conscious. We leave all that aside. We go with when things are conscious. So if organism O's neural system is in an end state at t, then O is conscious at this moment in time, t. So let's take again 2 theories, recursive processing and the Nmda receptor theory by Hans Flohr, meaning that if the Nmda receptor is activated, then you're conscious. Then we can add, so what happens if we block the Nmda receptor? This is what happens in a broad range of anesthetic cocktails, right? So, and we know that there is something like anesthetic awareness. So if we could find out that people with a blocked NMDA receptor are conscious or not, we could find out which one is the better NCC. If they are conscious, well, then likely recursive processing is better because it can occur without NMDA receptor activation. But here's again the problem. Consciousness is non-public. And most contentious stages, sleep phases, anesthesia, coma, take any type of really weird drug, also come with diminished cognitive capabilities and cognitive access, and therefore are hardly decisive, or not decisive under any state. So better not go with contentious phases in a human's life. Let's go with something a little bit nicer. Awake humans. The what test. Here you predict conscious content, what people are conscious of. If organism O's neural system is in the end state at t, then O is conscious of at t of x. Here's an example by Horikawa and colleagues. What they did is they recorded sleep fMRI, and they used this together with dream reports after awakening to train a neural net. So they use this together with a semantic net approach to find out which neural activation indicates probably which type of semantic content, a key, a street, a house. And then they took new data and fed this into this pattern classifier. And they found out that they can pretty well predict dream reports, right? And as dreams are conscious, right, these dream reports are supposed to reflect the dream experience. So you're really predicting what people were dreaming of. But I've got two problems with this. First of all, phenomenality is not necessarily reducible to content. Ned Block introduced the distinction between mental paint and mental latex, which are independent of representation content. What I'm conscious of does not necessarily entail how I'm conscious of what I'm conscious of. So you might know with Horikawa's method that I was dreaming of a key, but you don't know whether I was consciously thinking of a key, whether I was seeing a key, whether I held a key in my hand, and all these kind of things. Second thing is, even if consciousness is reducible to content, our tests need to make an additional presumption, namely how content is fixed. You need to know first what is the content of a neural vehicle, and then you can know what I'm conscious of, right? So our tests are then ambiguous. Either we've got wrong what makes a content conscious, or we got wrong how content is fixed in the brain. So this is not nice. I think the best test is the how test. In the how test, we're really trying to predict phenomenal experience independently of content. So if organism owes neural systems in the end state at t, then O is conscious at t of x in the y way, right? And the cool thing is, what we can use here is inter-individual differences. You are all probably aware that I have a bigger head than other people, and you might have a smaller or bigger head or whatever than other people. So your neural matter inside that head differs, right? You might have a larger or smaller visual cortex. This is the difference between, in red, V1 across 3 individuals. Now you might use this to predict how these people experience visually in a certain way. And Gensha and colleagues did this in a really ingenious way, how you measure the speed of consciousness, right? So what they did is they used a binocular rivalry paradigm. They presented to the left eye one stimulus and to the right eye another. And the interesting thing is that the percept switches. So the left eye started with being presented something. And because our brain likes novelty, this is what you experience. Then shortly after, another stimulus presented to the right eye. And again, our brain loves novelty, right? So percept switches. Then you introduce a slight change in the suppressed stimulus. And this triggers what's called traveling wave. The percept switches from what's being presented to one eye to what's being presented to the other eye. And there's a slow progression from one end to the other. So it's not a perfect switch, it's a slow fold of what's happening. And then there's this, you see this, this little black dot there. This indicates when people should press the button. So we know where the traveling wave started. We know when people will press the button. So if it starts there, you have to press the button. And then you can measure how long it took for a specific person to reach this point, right? And the idea is that if your consciousness has to really, if consciousness corresponds to roughly your visual field to the size of your visual cortex, well then in a large visual cortex, it should take longer to get from one point to another than in a smaller one, right? So this is the prediction that they used. And indeed it does. So the larger the visual cortex, the longer it takes for the traveling wave to cross the visual field. And the p-values are pretty good. So Vanya, how much time do I have? I think I'm over time, right?
Yeah, we do need to save like 20 minutes for questions, but for now, there's only one question, so we could take a bit more time.
Okay, so I'm going to be quick a little bit. Going to take, how about we take that question? And then we'll see. If no other question comes up, then I'm going to continue.
Oh, Leo is asking because she might miss why do we think fish are not conscious? But then Anna and Akin was answering the question in the Gallaton, and they said because we just simply don't know. We went to human because we can ask them contrary to the fish. And Akin also posted because you were talking about hypotheses that suggest the cortical thalamic connection are necessary for the consciousness. And since fish don't have a cortex, so this hypothesis is unlikely to support the consciousness of the fish. So they kind of already like self-answered. Good job.
Great, yeah. Well, but this raises a good point, right? In the answer, people pretty much presumed that the cortex is necessary. So there are readings of these theories that go beyond mere sufficiency. And so I'm going to talk about this because I think what Leo raised there, the question, points to a general tension in that kind of field. So I'm going to talk for 3 minutes roughly. I'll try to be quick to talk about how we can test beyond sufficiency. Okay. If you're interested in this is a paper that I wrote in 2016, which says that the old neurocorrelate is kind of has a big problem. And this is because it so much rests on mere sufficiency. Here's a standard that we use in science, comparative testing, right? Comparative testing means that there are two theories that concern the same section of reality. One could be a null hypothesis, the other could be your hypothesis, right? Or you could have two really substantial theories, none of them being a null hypothesis. But if they concern the same section of reality, well, then we think that they can't both be true if they're really different theories. So if theory 1 is right, then X should be the case. And if theory 2 is right, then Y should be the case. So the standard question in science is then, well, let's see if X or Y is the case, right? And we have this all over science, these kind of experimenta crucis, the crucial experiments or the comparative tests. Here's the most famous example, right? Eddington's experience trying to distinguish between Newtonian physics and Einsteinian physics. The distinction was that Newton and Einstein made different kind of predictions how light should bend if it crosses a star, right? And so what Eddington did was calculate the difference where a specific star should appear given a solar eclipse, given these one or the other theory, right? And then it was just a matter of, pointing where the stars are, finding out which made the better prediction. And very often this is seen as the victory for Einstein, the experimental victory for Einstein. And in principle, it looks as if, the fish case is as a case in point, that something like this should be possible for consciousness studies as well, right? So there are different type of theories that make different predictions which systems should be conscious. So let's take recursive processing theory and one personal favorite, the integrated information theory. So you have three systems down there, and the one is just a simple feed-forward network, the other is a circular network, and the last is a simply inactive brain, not a dead brain, an inactive brain, right? And I'm taking specifically just as an illustration the 2004 paper by Tononi. So integrated information theory has really progressed since then. Now, recursive processing theory would clearly say to the first, there is no recursive processing going on, right? So there should not be any consciousness. But in the B system, well, there could be some recursive processing going on depending on how these connections are done. So that could be conscious in this system. But in inactive brain, certainly there's no recurrent processing going on, right? Because there's no current at all, right? So no consciousness there. Integrated information theory, at least in the 2004 version, says that, well, the feed-forward network could have an amount of integrated information higher than 0, so it could be conscious. But this system, the B system, has no consciousness, right? But an inactive system, because a 0 just carries as much information as a 1, well, an inactive system could be conscious. Maybe not something interesting, but it could be conscious, right? So these two make different predictions, right? And if we could find out which of these systems is conscious and which one isn't, it looks as if we could find out, which one is the right theory to go for. But the problem is that we then overinterpret what these theories are saying if they're predicting neural correlates. We would need necessity for these comparative testing. We would say that integrated information is necessary for consciousness, or recursive processing is necessary for consciousness, or the cortex is necessary for consciousness. Otherwise, we cannot reason from the presence of conscious when a brain is not in an end state, there's no recursive processing, phi equals 0, to the fact that N is not an NCC. If we stick with Chalmers' definition of what an neural correlate of consciousness is, N only needs to be sufficient, and it can only be sufficient. So both of these theories can be right. Everybody wins. Yay. Every theory can be true, right? If they all just predict Chalmers NCC, because they all can be sufficient. Awesome. It's pretty much like, so Germany is the land of rules, right? If you're parking in front of on a bicycle lane, right, you get a fine. But unfortunately, if you're not parking on a bicycle lane, you can't reason that you're not getting a fine. You could be standing in front of a fire hydrant or something like this. You would get a fine. So this is the reasoning that's being wrong here. Cannot be any kind of comparative testing in NCC research, because if we stick with the Chalmers definition, they only can be sufficiency. And for comparative testing, we need necessity. So we need a new definition of a neural correlate. And I think the challenge is we had good reasons to think that they're merely sufficient. So the challenge is to combine mere sufficiency on one level with necessity on another. And I think the best way to do this is to distinguish between types and tokens. Each neural token is merely sufficient for a conscious token, but some token of a neural type, like the neural type, is necessary for for any conscious token. The second is we have to reconsider that all tokens of a type have some feature in common, some type-making feature. So what we seek is a neural feature F such that all neural activation correlate that have F also correlate with consciousness of that type C. So F is the type NCC of C. So we're looking for features, not anymore for just systems. And the prediction is, what we need is, well, we have to predict conscious features. And that's where all the kind of previous 4 tests come in. So each neural feature F being picked is what makes a neural state a neural correlate of consciousness. So theories must claim that only if your brain is in a state that is F are you conscious. And I call this the NCC maker, or the type NCC. And that's what we're actually looking for. And that's how we should interpret these theories. I'm going to skip this. This is just the definition. And I'm just going to tell you, if you're interested in this, we have this awesome journal, Philosophy and the Mind Sciences. And we just had the first issue of a 2-issue series looking at where the neural correlate of consciousness is standing at the moment. And the first issue is packed with great names. So have a look at it. This is already out. The new one is coming just in a few months. And thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward for some questions and some discussion. So thank you so much. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something. And yeah, so Vanya, whenever you want to share, just tell me I should shut up.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Sasha. And just take a look at the chat, whether there are any more questions. So there's a question about neural tokens, and I can just read it to you. It is from Eliza. It is not clear for me what a neural token is. Can pyramidal neurons be considered neural tokens, since they have also been considered in the past as plausible NCC candidates?
Yeah, great question. So what I mean with a neural token is something, I'm thinking more of neural activation, right? A pyramidal cell itself just exists, right? It's not in a specific moment, right? But my experience is always in a specific moment. So what we should think of is more neural activation. So for example, the specific activation of pyramidal cells could be such a neural token. It's a neural token activation, right? This could be one of the neural tokens we think about. And then the question is, so are pyramidal cells, activation of pyramidal cells, really the NCC? And when we think about this, then we would say, okay, like if there's activation in pyramidal cells, then you're conscious. Then we would talk about the type, right? So any activation in pyramidal cells, that would be the type, the neural type we're correlating with a conscious experience. A specific activation in a pyramidal cell would be a neural token, a specific activation at a specific moment in time. A non-repeatable activation, right, in this specific moment would be a neural token, which would be a token that could correlate with consciousness. Does that make it clearer? I hope it does.
I may have a question. Yes, and Elisa says, yes, it's clear. And cool. I may have a question myself. We talk about features of consciousness, and do we have to have all the features to be sufficient for the consciousness to exist, or just one of the features is enough?
So usually we would think that if there should be necessity, there should be a bundle of features, a set of features that you would have to have. And these would then really be necessary in a strong sense. Mind though that these features need not just be morphological features, right? We're talking more specific physiological features, right? So thalamocortical, you're picking out features by their anatomy. And by picking them out by their anatomy, you're already missing out that you can transpose this on fishes, right? So this might be not, we should maybe look for a little bit more abstractly at these things, right? Pyramidal cells might be something, but it's also very specific to a cell type, right? Maybe the features that in the end are the best candidates might be informational features, there might be computational features, there might be topological features, there might just be structural features. So I think that what's very often a problem is that NCC research is being seen as, oh, the big enemy of AI consciousness research, right? And if you're thinking about what are these features that can be implemented by a neural system, it could be that one informs the other, right? But it generally could be just a bunch of features. But in the end, we should hone in on that set of features which is really necessary, because this would help us also the most, I think. Make it clearer?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
Cool.
And there's a follow-up question from Elisa, and she said, we said that all the scientific theories win right now. Are they equally valid, or do we have some further directions for the future?
Yeah, lovely question. Yes. So they don't win, right? It's just none of them goes away, which is very unusual for any field of science, right? We never had a field of science where just the amount of theories grow, right? But none of them dies out. This has never happened in science. So this means that there's something fundamentally wrong, right? Or that we're really, like, I think conscious study always had this kind of little taste of it might be a pseudoscience. I don't think it is, but I think because theories don't die out in that field, there's a danger that that we're facing. If we're just looking for sufficient conditions, we just end up with a whole range of theories. So they all would be equally valid if when that type of neural correlate appears, then that person is also conscious, right? So some of these have been discarded for these reasons, right? So maybe there could be NMDA receptor activation, but people are still unconscious. Then that would not be a neural correlate. But for all those that do predict in the right way which things are sufficient, you do have a broad range of things that could still go forward, right? And so honestly, there's this really bad joke, like consciousness theories are like toothbrushes. Everybody has one. Nobody wants to use that of anybody else. And so that's pretty much the problem where we're facing at sometimes, that people do prefer certain theories, but they're not really to pit them against each other. This comparative testing that I was talking about, that is missing. And I think this would be like the big leap forward. I think this is what we should do more. But it means also that we have to understand neural correlates a little bit differently.
We have the last question here from Tristan. I should avoid pronouncing any names, but he said, if we introduce types of consciousness, how do we know that certain types are actually consciousness are not something else entirely?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean, that comes back to the methodological question, right? The epistemic question. How can we actually assess consciousness? That's the crucial thing. But this is also the reason why I think that most of these types have to be tested in awake adult humans, right? So what we should, I think what would be the best way, because there we're pretty certain that, you know, like all the people that I look at here at the screen, I think you're conscious. If you're not simulations, right, you're conscious. I'm pretty sure that you are, right? And this, we should, the further I go away from this, the harder it is. But even in an adult human, we can manipulate, and we're getting better and better with really manipulating brains. And this is the next step forward, I think, really manipulating people and looking at individual experience, individual differences, right? So there we have certain types, and these types change systematically, right? These are very often structural types, right? And so if there's this nice isomorphism, or at least some kind of morphism, we could exploit this for further testing. So we can never be certain. We really have to test it. That's we don't know this per se, which types are conscious. We have to hypothesize and test. I think this is the answer that I want to give.
I think we maybe we move to the speaker corner and have further discuss. But before we move there, we have the last comment from Timo, and he said, "I think science is not very good equipped in answering questions of necessity. Isn't it very hard to look for necessity? Thanks for the talk, engaging."
Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to look for necessity. That obviously, but science is hard, right? But that doesn't mean that science can't really go and investigate necessity, right? We hypothesize what's necessary and we test this. And after a range of tests, we're pretty sure that nothing can go faster than light. We're pretty sure that two things that are chained to each other will still fall at the same speed, at the same rate, in the same area. So we think that those are nomological necessities, and we didn't just invent them. We tried to find them empirically, at least in some cases. And sometimes, I don't know, we for example, like we've got this in other areas too. In biology, you would think that by necessity there shouldn't be an animal at the polar region with huge ears, right? Because they could just cool down, right? So there are certain types of very like low cooked necessity that we might find a posteriori, and science is pretty good with a posteriori stuff, I would say. So yes, I mean, in a strong sense, we don't know that things are necessary, but we hypothesize that they are, and we try to test it. So in the end, we can't really know it. We just get more confident in our hypothesis. I don't know what else to say. Thank you so much for the question. Oh, and thank you, Vanya and Sushi for hosting. Thank you so much. So I guess I'll be in the speaker's corner then, right?
Yes. Okay.
Cool. Well done. Have a nice night.
It's amazing. I mean, it's very enlightening, and I feel like everyone must be like dazzled and amazed, just like me.
Right. So, come over to the Speaker's Corner, talk to me. I'm happy to do that. I look forward to it.